Today I'm going to talk about 2 centuries of evidence on children and mothers' work. So let me begin with a fact and a question. Women's labor force participation in the US has stopped increasing. That's a fact. Why is it? What can we do about it? So just to put that in perspective, you'll see here women's labor force participation, LFP as it's sometimes called, from 1950 to 2018. It's been going up from the low 30s to around 60 at its peak and now has trended down. And if we focus in just on the most recent years, you can see that very, very clearly, 2010 to 2018. What's going on here? Question 2, from an altogether different part of the world. In the developing world, we've also seen women's labor force participation going down. Are these 2 phenomena linked? Why is it happening? What can we do about it? So those are our motivating questions. So just to put the developing world into context, here are 2 snapshots from sub-Saharan Africa and from Asia. GDP per capita on the x-axis, relatively low, $2,500, $2,700. And you can see in sub-Saharan Africa most clearly, but also to some extent in Asia, that downward or slightly negative trajectory, more pronounced in one case than the other. So those are the facts. And those are the questions. So how do we answer them? Well, we'll begin first by just asking what existing research is out there? What do we know about this? So one interesting set of facts which we observe here, which are depicted in this bubble, is that there is a fair amount of evidence that children lead to a decrease in the labor force participation of married women. So that effect is negative, and it's been documented across a variety of economies. That bubble points to evidence mainly from the US and from Northern Europe. There's a smaller strand of evidence that tells us that the effect in developing countries tends not to be negative. In fact, it is often 0 or even potentially positive, and I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. So taking those pieces of evidence and arraying them on an x-axis, this is sort of our hypothesis, and this is the question we're going to ask. The x-axis here is economic development. Think of it as GDP per capita, which is how we're going to measure it. These dots from the existing literature seem to be sort of tracing out an implicit curve, which says that at low levels of development, the effect of fertility on labor supply is low, or even 0, nil, and it becomes more negative over time. And so our question in this project is twofold. Number one, is that really a pattern, right? This is just, connect the dots based on existing evidence. Can we really find that pattern in the data? Number 2, if we do find that pattern in the data, does it actually answer the 2 questions I started out with? So one step at a time. So first step, we assemble a data set. That data set spans 429 country years. What's a country year? For example, a country year could be the US in 1980. That set of country years are reflected by the shaded countries on the map, and our data starts in 1787 and ends in 2014. So we're really spanning the history of economic development, and we're also spanning it cross-sectionally from place to place. The data represents or is representative of 4 billion mothers over that time period. It's a large data set. So here is one sort of picture from that data set. This is just the labor force participation of women. If you focus on the green and red lines, you'll see a slight U-shaped pattern there. That U-shaped pattern is indeed called sort of the U-shaped pattern of women's labor force participation. And the observation there is that in the process of development, early on, labor force participation tends to be high. These are largely agricultural economies. In the early stages of development, it goes down, and then it eventually increases again. The blue line here actually is the US data. So the earliest data point here, when did the US have GDP per capita of approximately $2,500? The answer is 1860. So the early data points here are for the US in the 1800s. You don't see the U-shaped pattern there, but economic historians, in particular Claudia Golden and other historians, have argued that that is entirely due to mismeasurement. If you correctly measured labor force participation of women in the US in the 1800s and the early 1900s, you would also see that U-shaped pattern. So that explains the US data. Now, coming to our results. This is a very stylized version of our results. I'm going to show you the messier version in a minute. Right? But our results basically show that if you look at the effect of fertility, an incremental child, on whether or not the mother is working, in the labor force, we find that the effect is indeed roughly nil for low GDP countries. We see this portion where it becomes more negative, and then for high GDP countries, the effect is negative. It's about 10%, so one child leads to a 10% reduction in labor force participation in high GDP countries. That flat portion early on is also the same for the US and Northern Europe in the historical data. For someone interested in policy questions, it's of course immensely interesting when two incredibly different places in time and in geography end up having a very similar effect. You sort of ask yourself, maybe the same mechanism is at work. What's going on here? And so the US data, just to get into a bit of the messiness, this is the US from 1860 to 2010. You can see the same basic pattern there. Notable that early on, in fact, in the US, the effect is potentially positive. And as I said, that's going to prove to be important. More children, higher labor force participation, particularly in the early years. These are the results for the entire world, back to the global data set. And it's more compressed because we want to get all the data in there. But if you sort of stare at it, you can see the same pattern. It starts out sort of flat, near zero, becomes more negative, and then flattens out again. Zooming in on the early periods, that positive effect, more children, higher labor force participation. You can also see it if you really zoom in and look at the data. So that's sort of averaging over all those noisy data points. It gives you that kind of figure, which shows you where my sort of red line came earlier in the talk. So what's going on here? How does it get back to the questions that we asked? Well, the way we try to do that is we try to slice the data into two groups, and we look at whether the result whether we see the same result in both halves of the data. How do we slice the data? One slice of the data are mothers who are in professional occupations or who have older children. The other slice of the data are mothers who are in non-professional occupations or who have younger children. What's the difference here? In one group, there's a high ability to pay for childcare and a relatively low demand for childcare. And in the other group, there's a relatively low ability to pay for childcare and a relatively high demand. You can see which group is driving the pattern that we're seeing. And remember, this is not just the US, this is essentially across the world. Another slice, which shows us something similar, different way of cutting it, agricultural work versus non-agricultural work. In agricultural work, it's an occupation that's traditionally been compatible with having children at the same time. And so again, we can see this is driven by non-agricultural work. So in the background here, we do know something about what's happened, at least in the US and in Northern Europe over the 19th and 20th centuries. There's been this sectoral shift of women's work from agricultural work into occupations which are increasingly incompatible with simultaneous childcare. And so the occupational shift has led to an increase in the demand for and the cost of childcare. And we believe that occupational shift is what is driving our results in this very broad data set. And so if we come back to question one, what's going on here? We believe the answer is indeed increased childcare costs. And we believe that 2 centuries of evidence are essentially consistent with that. Now, in the developed world, the answer is a little bit trickier. So, I showed you this picture, and the developed world portion of it is early on where the effect is approximately zero. Why would that lead to decreased labor force participation among mothers? Well, the trick is to recognize that the figure actually looks like this. It's not zero, but in fact it's slightly positive. More children, more labor force participation. Why are we seeing that? What we're basically seeing here is what you could call a subsistence effect. In order to pay for the child, you have to work more. And as GDP increases, as countries experience economic development, that effect is essentially going away. Mothers no longer have to work in order to provide for the child, and hence we are seeing meaningful decreases in labor force participation among mothers. And so, in developing countries, this is important because labor force participation is important not only for social reasons, but is also important economically. Higher labor force participation is an important driver of economic growth. And so this is a significant challenge in the developing world. And so how do we make this link happen? Well, that sort of comes back to the two strands of our work. Strand number one, in high-income countries, if we care about the work of mothers, and we do, then our results point to the fact that we cannot ignore childcare costs. We're not the first people to say this. This is in the air. We've thought about this a lot. But what's interesting is we have this incredibly broad and deep data set to point us back to this fact which we thought was important. The evidence points that way very strongly. In the developing world, instead, the picture is more complicated. We find that the natural economic forces of economic growth, which economists like to think are going to sort of cure all ills, in this case, in fact, that pressure is not going to lead to an increase in women's labor force participation. In fact, on the contrary, the natural economic pressure is going to lead in the opposite direction. And so that tells us that if we want to increase women's labor force participation, we're actually going to have to look away from the market and toward changes in social norms and in how the value of women's work is perceived. And so two entirely different points in time, two entirely different places in the world, a similar mechanism at work, but with very, very different policy implications depending on the context. Thank you very much. I look forward to speaking to many of you later in the day.